The 61st line of the proof was not there when senior verifier Ossel Trenick sealed the laboratory at 1900 hours. He was certain of this because he had counted every line himself, kneeling on the hard, polished floor of Research Chamber 14 with his scanner pressed flat against the dark stone tiles, cataloging each mark the human had made. 60 lines. 60 lines of dense, interlocking mathematics written in white calciumite chalk, spiraling outward from the center of the chamber in a pattern that Trenick's optical array could follow but his mind could not parse. He had logged each line, tagged its position, verified its terminus, measured the chalk density at 14 sample points per line. 60 lines. He had sealed the chamber, engaged the locking protocol biometric plus rotational cipher, Institute standard, and walked the 300 meters of dim corridor to his quarters for his rest cycle. When he returned 7 hours later, there were 61. The additional line began at the precise terminus of line 47, a branching derivation that curved southeast across the floor for approximately 90 centimeters before ending in a symbol Trenick did not recognize. Not a Nithari mathematical symbol, not a Terran one. He checked the Universal Glyph Index, all 412 registered notational systems across the 11 spacefaring species that maintained formal mathematics. Nothing matched. He ran the shape through 11 translation matrices, each calibrated to a different species' symbolic conventions, then through 3 heuristic pattern matchers designed to identify novel notation by structural analogy. Nothing. He stood over it for a long time, his breath fogging the cold air of the chamber. The daylight panels above cast their steady full-spectrum noon across the chalk lines, and the new symbol sat there on the dark stone floor like a word in a language that should not exist yet. Then he called Director Vale. "The human's proof has grown," he said, while the chamber was sealed. Vale arrived in 14 minutes. She was the director of the Nithari Institute for Foundational Mathematics, a position she had held for 22 years, and in that time she had overseen 1,100 proofs, 3 paradigm-altering discoveries, and not a single unexplained event. Unexplained events did not occur at the Institute. The Institute existed specifically to explain things. Its corridors were quiet, its research chambers temperature-controlled, and its verification processes were the most rigorous in the cooperative. Things that happened here had reasons, and those reasons had proofs, and those proofs had been checked. She looked at the 61st line. She looked at Trenick. She pulled the chamber's security log on her personal tablet and reviewed every entry from the previous 12 hours. "The seal was not broken," she said. "It was not. No one entered. No one entered. The atmospheric log shows no change in composition, no thermal variance, no pressure differential. I verified the seal integrity readings at 0.003 granularity. The chamber was empty and sealed from 1900 to 0200. Nothing went in. Nothing came out." Vale knelt on the floor beside the 61st line. The chalk was white calciumite, the same supply Halden used, a specialized Terran formula he had brought with him, denser and more adherent than standard marking chalk, because he said it held its edge better on polished stone. The stroke pressure was consistent, moderate, steady, the pressure of a hand that had been writing for months and knew exactly how hard to push. The width was 2.3 millimeters, within the normal variance of Halden's work. And the curvature, the subtle rightward drift that appeared in every line Halden drew, a consequence of his unusual grip, was present. "Where is Halden now?" Vale asked. "In his quarters. He has not left since 2300 last night. The corridor sensors confirm continuous presence. I checked them twice." "Bring him." Dr. Ren Halden was 44 years old, Terran standard. He had arrived at the Nithari Institute 7 months earlier on a joint research appointment, the first human mathematician ever granted access to the Institute's foundational research program. His field was topological invariance, the study of mathematical properties that survive transformation, that remain true no matter how hard you twist and deform the structure around them. In Terran academic circles, he was considered brilliant but difficult. Not difficult in temperament. Everyone who worked with him described him as patient, quiet, and unfailingly polite, but difficult in the sense that his approach to mathematics made other mathematicians uncomfortable. He did not use computers. He did not collaborate. He worked on floors. This last point had caused considerable discussion during his intake process. The Nithari mathematical tradition was ancient, rigorous, and deeply collaborative. Proofs were built by teams. Each line was verified before the next was written. Progress was measured in generations. A single major proof could take 40 years and involve hundreds of contributors, each adding their verified segment to the whole, the way a cathedral is built stone by stone, with each mason checking the stone beneath before laying the one above. Haldon worked alone, on his knees in chalk on stone. He had explained to Trennick during the intake interview that he needed to see the entire structure at once, needed to be inside it, needed to walk through it the way you walk through a building to understand its architecture. Paper was too small. Screens were too flat. They forced the mathematics into 2 dimensions and it died there, pinned and dissected like a specimen. The proof needs to breathe, he had said, and Trennick had logged that phrase in the project file because it was his job to log everything, and because he did not understand it. The Nithari had given him Research Chamber 14, the largest single-room space in the Institute. 12 meters by 14 meters of dark polished stone, lit by daylight panels that simulated the full-spectrum illumination of the Nithari homeworld's equatorial noon. Haldon had requested that the daylight remain on at all times, even during his absence. Consistent light for consistent work, he had said, and Trennick had logged that too without understanding it. For 7 months, Haldon had been working on what the Nithari called the convergence problem, a foundational question in topological mathematics that had resisted proof for over 300 years. The problem was deceptively simple to state. Given an infinite recursive topological structure, does there exist a finite set of invariants sufficient to determine its complete behavior? In plainer terms, can you describe an infinitely complex shape with a finite number of unchanging truths? 3 centuries of Nithari mathematics said no. The problem had been attacked by the finest mathematical minds in the cooperative, generation after generation, and every approach had failed. The consensus, codified in 11 published papers and 2 institute monographs, was that the convergence problem was undecidable, that no proof or disproof could exist within the Nithari mathematical framework. It was the kind of conclusion that hardened into dogma, because 3 centuries is long enough for a failure to stop looking like a failure and start looking like a fundamental truth about reality. Haldon disagreed. He had arrived with a 2-page summary of his approach, written in a notation so compressed that Vail's best translators took 3 weeks to unpack it. His approach was, by Nithari standards, insane. He proposed to prove convergence not by argument but by construction, by building a topological space so strange, so deliberately pathological, that the invariants would have no choice but to converge. A space that forced finite description by making infinite description paradoxical. He is trying to build a trap for infinity, Vail had said after reading the unpacked summary. She had meant it as criticism. She was not entirely sure it was. For 7 months, the proof had grown across the floor of Chamber 14. Line by line, day by day, the spiral of chalk had expanded outward from the center of the room, each new segment connecting to the previous ones through a web of logical dependencies that grew more complex and more beautiful and more opaque with every passing week. Haldon would arrive each morning, remove his shoes at the threshold, step barefoot into the spiral, and begin. He worked in silence. He did not use a calculator or a computational console. He wrote from memory, or from something deeper than memory, from a place where the mathematics seemed to live inside his body like a second nervous system, guiding his hand the way instinct guides a bird's wing. His chalk grip was unusual even by Terran standards. Second and third fingers rather than the conventional first and second. The chalk braced against the pad of his thumb at an angle that gave him extraordinary control over stroke width at the cost of speed. He wrote slowly, deliberately. Each line took between 40 minutes and 3 hours. Trennick observed him daily. It was his assignment, and he approached it with the thoroughness that had earned him the senior verifier title. He cataloged each new line, verified its connection to the previous lines, measured its physical properties, and attempted to follow the logic. For the first 40 lines, he could. The mathematics was unconventional but trackable. Haldon was constructing a topological space step by step, defining its properties through a cascading series of transformations that stripped away dimension after dimension, until only the invariants remained. It was like watching a sculptor remove stone to reveal the shape inside, except the shape was abstract, and the stone was everything that was not essential. At line 41, Trennick lost the thread. Not because the mathematics became wrong, but because it became something he had no framework for. The notation shifted. The logic bent in directions that felt spatial but were not spatial, that seemed to involve axes of reasoning his mind had no apparatus for. The transformations Haldon was describing could not exist in any topological space Trennick knew of. They described operations that worked in directions he could point to on the floor, but could not explain in words. He reported this to Vail. I can no longer follow the proof beyond line 40. Is it inconsistent? I cannot determine inconsistency in a framework I do not understand. I can verify that each line connects to the previous ones, and that the notation is internally self-consistent, but I cannot tell you what it means. Continue observing, she said. Log everything. He did. Lines 41 through 60 arrived over the next 3 weeks, each one pushing deeper into territory that Trennick could describe physically. This line begins here, curves this way, uses these symbols but could not comprehend mathematically. He could copy the symbols. He could record their positions, but the meaning slid off his understanding the way water slides off thermal plating, present and visible, but refusing to be held. Haldon did not seem troubled by this. He worked the same way every day. Shoes off at the threshold. Barefoot walk through the spiral to the growing edge. Chalk in that strange two-fingered grip. Right. Sometimes he would stand in the center of the completed portion for 20 minutes or more without moving, his eyes tracking the lines the way a navigator tracks stellar drift, not reading them so much as feeling where they pointed, sensing the shape of what was not yet there. And now there were 61 lines, and no one had written the 61st. Haldon arrived at the laboratory in the clothes he had slept in, which were the clothes he had worked in, which were the same soft gray trousers and white cotton shirt he wore every day during an active proof. He did not change clothes during a proof. He had explained this once, something about consistency, about not breaking the continuity of the work with the interruption of choices that did not matter, and Trennick had logged it. He stepped into the chamber. He removed his shoes without being asked. He walked to the center of the spiral, and his eyes found the 61st line immediately, not with the surprise of someone seeing something unexpected, with the recognition of someone seeing something they had known was coming but had not known when. When did this appear? He asked. Between 1900 and 0200, Vail said. The chamber was sealed. No one entered. Haldon walked to the 61st line. He crouched beside it, his knees settling onto the dark stone between lines 12 and 13. His fingers hovered above the chalk but did not touch it. He studied the unknown symbol at the terminus for a long time, his head tilted at a slight angle, the way Trennick had seen him study his own work when he was trying to understand what he had just written. This is my handwriting, he said. We are aware. The pressure profile, the stroke width, the grip pattern, the rightward curvature drift, all consistent with your previous work across all 60 lines. Statistically indistinguishable. But you were not here. No, Haldon said. I was not here. He was quiet for a moment, then, but the proof was. Vale's secondary eyelids flickered, which Trennick had learned in 22 years of working with her meant. She was processing something she did not want to process. Explain that statement, she said. Haldon sat down on the floor, cross-legged, in the center of the spiral. He looked at the lines around him, radiating outward in their tightening gyre, and his expression held something Trennick could not name, not pride, not fear, something more like the quiet vertigo of a man standing at the edge of a cliff he had been building toward for 7 months. I have been building a topological space, he said, a space designed to force convergence, to trap infinity into a finite description. That is what I told you when I arrived, and that is what I have been doing. He pointed at the lines around him. But this is not just a description of that space. This is the space. The proof and the thing it proves are the same object. Trennick felt something cold move through his thorax. He had catalogued thousands of proofs in his career. None of them had ever been the thing they described. A proof about a bridge was not a bridge. A proof about a star was not a star. A proof about a topological space was not a topological space. The distinction between description and reality was so fundamental to Nithari mathematics that it was not even stated, it was assumed. The way gravity is assumed. The way the floor is assumed to be beneath your feet. That is not how mathematics works, Vale said. That is not how Nithari mathematics works, Haldon corrected, gently but without apology. You build proofs about structures, you describe things, you point at reality and say, this is what it is. You have done it brilliantly for 3,000 years, and you have built the most rigorous, most reliable mathematical tradition in the galaxy. He looked at her, and his voice was calm, composed, stating a fact. But you have never built a proof that is the structure. You have never made the map, and the territory the same thing. Because that is impossible. It was, Haldon said, until line 41. Vale looked at Trennick. Trennick looked at the floor. The chalk lines spiraled around them, white on dark stone, 61 lines of a proof that was apparently also the thing it proved. Line 41 is where Trennick lost the ability to follow the logic, Vale said. Yes, because line 41 is where the proof stopped being a description and started being the thing itself. Everything before line 41 is a description of a topological space. Everything after line 41 is a topological space. The mathematics is no longer about a structure, it is a structure. It has properties. It has behavior. He paused. It has growth. The chamber was very quiet. The daylight panels hummed their faint, steady hum. The chalk on the floor caught the simulated noon and held it, white and patient and absolutely still. You are saying, Vale said, that the 61st line wrote itself. I am saying that the 61st line is a consequence of the first 60. The topological space I constructed has reached a developmental stage where it generates its own structural extensions. The convergence I was trying to prove is happening. Here, on this floor. The space is converging, and the 61st line is where convergence began to express itself. Vale stood motionless for 11 seconds. Then she turned to Trennick. Verify the 61st line. Against what framework? I cannot follow the logic past line 40. Verify it against the first 40 lines. Check whether it is consistent with the portion of the proof you can follow, every logical connection, every dependency chain. If it contradicts anything in the verifiable range, we will know. It took Trennick 4 hours. He worked with the methodical precision that had defined his career, cross-referencing the 61st line's notation against every established connection in the first 40 lines, checking for contradictions, for type errors, for any break in logical continuity, for any violation of the foundational axioms that Haldon had laid down in lines 1 through 6. He checked the branching point at line 47, where the 61st line originated, traced the dependency chain backward through 23 intermediate steps, verified each step against the axioms. He found no contradictions. The 61st line was perfectly consistent with the rest of the proof. More than consistent, it was necessary. When he traced the logical implications forward from the existing lines, he found that the 61st line filled a gap he had not known existed. It answered a question that lines 43 through 59 were building toward, a question whose shape he could now see in the architecture of the proof, even though he could not understand the answer. The proof had answered its own question before Haldon had finished asking it. He reported this to Vail. Consistent. 0 contradictions across 417 verified connection points. And Director, the line is not just consistent. It is structurally necessary. Without it, the proof has an open dependency that lines 43 through 59 are converging toward. With it, the dependency resolves. Vail's jaw tightened. I need to bring in the verification board. Haldon looked up from where he sat in the center of the spiral. All right, but they should not stand on the lines. The verification board was 5 of the Institute's most senior mathematicians, each a specialist in a different branch of Nithari foundational theory. They arrived within the hour, summoned by Vail's priority code, their rest cycles interrupted, their expressions carrying the particular alertness of professionals who understood that Vail did not issue priority codes lightly. They removed their shoes at the threshold Haldon's rule, which Vail had not countermanded, and which none of the board members questioned, because there was something about the chalk lines on the dark floor that made stepping on them feel transgressive, like walking across a painting that was still wet. They walked the proof for 2 days. During those 2 days, Haldon sat in the center and answered questions. Not all of them, some questions he said he did not know the answer to, because the proof had moved past him in places, the way a river moves past the point where it was dammed. But many of them he answered with a patience that Trennick found remarkable, given that the questions often amounted to politely worded variations of, "This cannot be what it appears to be." It was what it appeared to be. Senior verifier Call, the board's topological specialist, reached the critical conclusion on the afternoon of the second day. She had spent the final 6 hours standing at the junction where line 40 connected to line 41, the hinge point, the threshold, the place where description became structure. She stood there without speaking, her optical ridges cycling through their full range, which meant she was thinking at maximum capacity, processing at a depth that most Nithari reached only once or twice in a career. Then she said, "This is a new kind of proof." "Yes," Haldon said. "A proof that is also the thing it proves, a map that is also the territory." Her voice had acquired the particular harmonic quality that Nithari voices developed when the speaker had reached a conclusion that reorganized their understanding of something they had previously considered settled. You have not merely proven convergence. You have created convergence. You have built a topological space that converges here on this floor, and its convergence is itself the proof. Yes. And the 61st line is the convergence expressing itself, the space extending its own structure. Yes. Will there be more lines? Haldon looked at the floor. He traced line 1 with his eyes, then followed the spiral outward through 40, 50, 60 lines to the 61st where it ended in the unknown symbol. I think so. I think the space will continue to generate structure until it reaches its final invariant state. The convergence is not instantaneous, it is a process. Each new line is a step toward completion. How many steps remain? I do not know. The space will tell us when it is done. Director Vail installed continuous visual monitoring in Chamber 14 the same afternoon. 4 high-resolution optical arrays, 1 in each corner, recording at maximum frame density, 12,000 frames per second. Whatever was writing on the floor, she intended to watch it happen. That night they gathered. All 5 members of the verification board, plus Vale, plus Trenick, plus 2 junior archivists assigned to maintain the recording logs. The chamber was sealed. Haldon was in his quarters, confirmed by corridor sensors. The daylight panels cast their steady noon across the 61 lines of chalk. For 3 hours and 14 minutes nothing happened. The chalk sat on the floor. The daylight held. The recording arrays captured 12,000 frames per second of absolute stillness. Then at 01:17, the chalk moved. Not all of it, just the terminus of line 61, the leading edge, the point where the unknown symbol ended. The white line extended itself, growing forward across the dark stone with slow, precise, deliberate strokes. As though an invisible hand holding an invisible piece of calciumite chalk was drawing on the floor of a sealed, empty laboratory, with the unhurried care of a man who had been doing this every day for 7 months. The optical arrays captured every frame. The line grew at approximately 12 centimeters per minute, which was Trenick checked against his 7 months of observation data, the exact average speed at which Haldon normally wrote. The pressure was Haldon's pressure. The width was Haldon's width. The rightward curvature drift was Haldon's drift. In the observation suite, no one spoke. 7 senior Nithari scientists and 2 junior archivists sat in a room designed for clinical detachment and watched mathematics write itself on a stone floor 300 meters from the sleeping man whose handwriting it wore. And the silence was not the absence of words, but the presence of something too large for words to carry. "It writes the way he writes," Call said very quietly, as though speaking louder might stop it. "Yes," Trenick said. "But he is not here." "No." "Then what is writing?" No one answered. The chalk moved. The line grew. The symbol extended into a longer expression that curved northward across the floor, passing between lines 9 and 10 without touching either, the way a careful hand navigates a crowded page. The 60-second line completed itself at 01:42, 25 minutes, approximately 3 meters of new chalk. When it stopped, the terminus held a variation of the unknown symbol, not identical to the first instance but clearly related, the way a word and its conjugation are related. A second term in a growing vocabulary. Haldon examined the recording the next morning. He sat in the center of the spiral, legs crossed, watching the footage on a portable display that Trenick held for him. He did not seem surprised. He did not seem frightened. He watched the chalk move with the expression of a man watching rain fall on a field he had planted and seeing the first shoots of green. "The symbol is a variable," he said, pointing at the terminus, "in the space's own notation. The topological space I built has developed its own symbolic language. That glyph is its first native term, a concept that the space needed to express and for which no existing notation was sufficient. He traced its shape in the air. It does not appear in any index because it has never existed before. The space invented it because the mathematics required it." "You are claiming," Vale said, "that a set of chalk marks on a stone floor has developed a capacity for symbolic invention." Haldon considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Not consciousness, not intention, not thought. The space does not think. It converges. The distinction is critical. A crystal does not decide to grow, it grows because its molecular geometry demands extension. This space does not decide to write the next line. The mathematics compels the next line because the topological structure demands completion. But the mathematics is no longer operating in abstract symbol space." He pressed his palm flat against the dark stone beside him. "It is operating here, physically. On this floor. This floor is not a workspace. It is a substrate." Over the next 12 days, 7 more lines appeared. Trenick cataloged each one with the exhaustive thoroughness that had become his entire professional identity during this assignment. Each line appeared during the night cycle, between 0100 and 0300. Each was written in Halden's hand, at Halden's speed, with Halden confirmed asleep in his quarters 300 meters away. Each extended the proof structure in directions that the verification board could observe and measure, but increasingly could not follow. The unknown glyphs multiplied. On line 66, a second native symbol appeared, rounder than the first, with an internal loop. On line 68, a third angular stacked, carrying a density of embedded meaning that Call said she could feel even though she could not read. The proof was developing a vocabulary, word by word, symbol by symbol, each one representing a concept for which 3,000 years of Nithari mathematics and 400 years of Terran mathematics had no name. Call spent 3 days attempting to decode the native notation, working from structural context the way a cryptanalyst works from word frequency and sentence position. She made partial progress. The first glyph represented something analogous to self-referential depth, a measure of how many layers of structure were nested inside a given point of the topological space. The second glyph denoted what she could only describe as structural memory, the degree to which a point retained information about its own construction history. The third remained opaque. It is building a description of itself, she told the board on the 4th day of her analysis. The space is using its own native language to describe its own properties, to characterize its own architecture from the inside. A map of the territory, Vale said, made by the territory. Yes. He said that was what he was building 7 months ago in his intake summary, a map that is also the territory. He built the foundation, lines 1 through 40. The space has been building the rest. On the 15th day since the 61st line's first appearance, Halden did something unexpected. He entered chamber 14 in the morning as usual. He removed his shoes as usual. He walked barefoot through the spiral to the center as usual, but instead of picking up his chalk, he simply sat, folded his legs, and looked. Trenick watched from the observation suite. For 6 hours, Halden did not move. He sat perfectly still in the center of the spiral that had outgrown him, tracing the lines with his gaze, his lips occasionally moving without sound, as though he were reading a text that existed at the edge of language, something that could almost be spoken but not quite, something that needed to be felt as much as understood. At the end of the 6th hour, he stood. He walked to line 70, the most recent line, written 3 nights ago by the space, and to the cluster of native glyphs at its terminus. He picked up his chalk, and the notation he wrote was not his own. It was the space's, the native glyphs, the symbols that appeared in no index, the language that the topological space had invented for itself. Halden wrote them in his own hand fluently, without hesitation, without pausing to consult any reference, as though he had always known them. As though sitting in the center of the converging space for 6 hours had taught him its language, the way immersion teaches a child to speak not by rules, not by translation, but by being inside the thing until the thing becomes part of you. He wrote for 41 minutes. When he stopped, line 70 had become a bridge, a structural connection between the outer reaches of the spiral and a region that the space's nightly growth had been approaching but not yet reached. Halden had seen where the proof was going. He had understood its trajectory through a language that was not Terran and not Nithari, and not anything that had existed 10 days ago. And he had built the connection himself, reaching ahead, setting a keystone before the arch had fully risen to meet it. The man and the mathematics were collaborating, not creator and creation, not author and text, partners, writing in the same language, building the same structure from both ends. The verification board examined the new section that afternoon. They compared the native glyphs Halden had written to the ones the space had generated autonomously during the night cycles. The analysis was unambiguous. The symbols were identical, not similar, not analogous. Identical, the same stroke dynamics, the same semantic load, the same structural function within the proof's architecture. Haldon had written the space's own language in his own hand, and the result was indistinguishable from the space writing it itself. The question of authorship, Call said that evening, standing at the threshold with her arms folded, is no longer meaningful. When Haldon writes, the proof grows. When the proof writes, the proof grows. The result is the same object. The mathematics does not distinguish between the two sources. It accepts both contributions as equally valid, equally native, equally structural. She paused. The proof does not care who holds the chalk. But we care, Vail said, for the record, for attribution, for understanding what is happening in this room. Do we? What would we do with that understanding? We cannot follow the mathematics past line 40. We cannot decode most of the native notation. We can verify consistency, and consistency holds. Every check passes. Every dependency chain resolves. Every axiom is respected. She looked at the spiral. But understanding the proof in the way we understand our own proofs is no longer available to us. We are witnesses now, not verifiers, witnesses. On the 23rd day, the proof reached its penultimate state. Lines 71 through 79 had filled the remaining structural connections between the outer spiral and the inner core. The topological space, rendered in chalk across the full breadth of Chamber 14's floor, was now a closed architecture, every branch connected, every derivation complete, every node linked to every other node through at least two independent logical paths. From above, it no longer looked like mathematics. It looked like something organic, neural, alive, a frozen thought mapped in white on dark stone. All except one gap. A single missing connection at the very center of the spiral, between the first line Haldon had written 7 months ago and the terminus of line 79, which the space had written 2 nights before. The gap was small, perhaps 30 centimeters of dark stone visible between two chalk endpoints, but it was structurally critical. Every chain of logic in the proof, no matter where it began in the outer spiral, eventually converged toward one side or the other of that gap. The entire structure was a cathedral with one missing keystone, an arch built from both sides, waiting for the final stone that would make it whole and make it stand. "Is that the final line?" Vail asked. She stood at the threshold. She had not entered the chamber since the 3rd day. "I believe so," Haldon said. He was standing at the edge of the gap, looking down at the dark stone between his first mark and the space's last. When that line is written, the topological space will reach its final invariant state. The convergence will be complete. The proof will be finished. Will you write it, or will the space? Haldon smiled. It was a small smile, private, the expression of a man who has arrived at a truth that is simultaneously obvious and bottomless and slightly funny. "I do not think there is a difference anymore," he said. That night, Trennick did not leave the observation suite. He sat at his console, scanners live, recording arrays running at maximum density. Every instrument he had pointed at the dark floor of a sealed chamber where the daylight held its steady noon. At 03:11, the chalk moved. The final line, line 80. It began at the terminus of line 79 and moved toward line 1. It moved slowly, 12 centimeters per minute. Haldon's speed, Haldon's pressure, Haldon's grip. The chalk laid itself down on the dark stone with the unhurried care of a hand that knows exactly where it is going and is in no rush to arrive, because the arriving is not the point, the act of connecting is. And simultaneously, and the optical arrays captured this in perfect synchronization, and Trennick verified the timestamps 9 times afterward, and the verification board reviewed his verification and verified it again. Something was happening 300 meters away. Haldon was writing in his sleep. He was lying in his bed, eyes closed, breathing slow and even, and his right hand was moving above his chest. His fingers were curled in that distinctive grip, second and third fingers. Chalk braced against the thumb pad, and his hand was tracing shapes in the air. The corridor cameras recorded it, and when Trennick synchronized the footage frame by frame, pixel by pixel, the movements matched. Haldon's hand in the air and the chalk on the floor were drawing the same line, the same curve, the same symbols, at the same speed, at the same time, separated by 300 meters of sealed corridor, and every assumption that the Nithari mathematical tradition had ever made about the boundary between a mind and the marks it leaves on the world. The man was dreaming the mathematics, or the mathematics was dreaming the man. Or both of those descriptions were inadequate, and the truth was something simpler and stranger. That the proof and the prover had become one process, one act of convergence expressed through two hands, one made of flesh, and one made of nothing but the force of mathematical necessity doing what mathematical necessity does, which is complete itself. Line 80 crossed the gap. It connected to line 1. The spiral closed. Every sensor in Trennick's console registered the completion simultaneously. Atmospheric pressure in the chamber shifted by 0.002%, negligible, meaningless, except that the chamber had been sealed and nothing should have changed. The daylight panels flickered for 1/8 of a second. And the chalk, all 80 lines of it, the entire converged topological space, settled. That was the only word Trennick could find for it. The lines did not move or glow or vibrate. They settled, the way a building settles when the last beam is placed and the load distributes evenly across the whole structure, and everything becomes what it was always going to be. The convergence problem was solved. 300 years of mathematical consensus overturned, 80 lines of chalk on a stone floor. The answer was yes. A finite set of invariants could describe an infinitely complex structure, and the proof was not an argument for this claim. The proof was an instance of it. A converged topological space, physically instantiated in white calciumite chalk on polished Nithari stone, described in its own invented language, constructed by a human mathematician and by itself. In his quarters, Haldon's hand stopped moving. His breathing deepened into ordinary sleep. The corridor sensors recorded nothing unusual. Director Vail convened the formal review the following morning. 11 senior mathematicians, 3 external validators from allied institutes, 2 representatives from the Nithari Science Council. For 9 days, they walked the proof, line by line, connection by connection. They verified lines 1 through 40. Comprehensible, unconventional, brilliant. They verified that lines 41 through 80 were consistent with lines 1 through 40. 0 contradictions across 417 connection points. They verified the final connection, line 80, closing the spiral, linking to line 1, and confirmed that it satisfied every necessary and sufficient condition for a valid proof of the convergence problem. But they could not understand lines 41 through 80. Not fully. The mathematics operated in a framework no existing institution had developed. It used notation the proof itself had generated. It described structural properties for which existing theory had no names and no precedent. The proof was valid, it was consistent, it was complete, and it was beyond them. Call delivered the board's finding on a bright morning in the Institute's central hall. She spoke carefully, precisely, knowing that every word would live in the canon for centuries. The proof is correct. We cannot fully explain it, but it is correct. She paused. We are also unable to determine with certainty who wrote it. Dr. Haldon wrote the first 40 lines. Lines 41 through 80 were produced by a process involving autonomous structural extension of the mathematical object Haldon created, using symbolic notation invented by the proof itself. We cannot assign sole authorship to Dr. Haldon, nor can we assign it to the proof. Then who is the author of record? Call looked at the spiral on the display feed. The proof is its own author. The finding was published. The convergence problem was marked as resolved in the Nithari mathematical canon, with a notation that Trenek found accurate and utterly insufficient. Proved by collaborative construction. Research Chamber 14, Nithari Institute for Foundational Mathematics. Primary contributor, Dr. Ren Halden, Tehran. Primary contributor, as though the proof had submitted a lesser share. Halden did not attend the ceremony. Trenek found him in Chamber 14, sitting in the center of the completed spiral, shoes off, legs crossed. The daylight panels held their noon. The chalk lines surrounded him in their closed, finished, converged pattern, and he sat among them the way a man sits inside a cathedral he helped build and that now contains him. The finding has been published, Trenek said from the threshold. I know. Trenek hesitated. Then he asked the question that had been forming in him for 23 days. When the proof was writing itself at night, when the chalk moved on its own and your hand moved in your sleep 300 meters away, he paused. What did it feel like? Halden was quiet for a moment. His hand rested on the dark stone beside line 1, the first mark he had made in this room 7 months ago, when the proof was just an idea, and the floor was just a floor, and the distinction between a mathematician and his mathematics was still clear. It felt like being a sentence in a paragraph, he said. You know you are a sentence. You know what you say, where you begin and end. But you can feel the paragraph continuing past you, carrying a meaning that includes you but is larger than you. And the paragraph is part of a chapter, and the chapter is part of a book, and the book is part of something else entirely. He paused. And at some point you stop asking who is writing. You just let the meaning continue. Trenek stood at the threshold and looked at the spiral. 80 lines of chalk on dark stone, lit by simulated noon. Complete, converged, still. They had reviewed every variable in Halden's proof. Every axiom, every dependency, every logical chain across 417 verified connection points. Every variable held. Every check passed. But the 61st line, the line that appeared in a sealed, empty room, written in a sleeping man's handwriting, in a language that had not existed until the proof required it, that line was not a variable. It was not something Halden had placed. It was not something the board could replicate. It was not something the institute could file under any existing category of mathematical work. It was the moment the proof stopped being about reality and started being real. Trenek sealed the chamber for the last time. He walked the dim corridor toward his quarters, and behind him the daylight held steady in a room where a human had started a thought and the thought had finished itself, and neither had let go of the chalk. That was the thing about humans that no verification board would ever fully catalog. Not their endurance, not their creativity, not their tolerance for neurotoxic stimulants or their unusual writing grips or their insistence on working barefoot on stone floors. It was that they could build something, a proof, a space, an idea, and believe in it so completely, with such absolute and unwavering commitment to the possibility that the thing they imagined could be true, that the thing itself would start to believe too. Line 61 was the proof's first act of faith. And the human had taught it how.